Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kashaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
Hey, Dr. C here with you. Solo episode here. This is a funny thing. It's early in the morning. It's still dark outside. I'm looking out the window. It's in the beautiful Sonoran Desert sunrise. Just got back from a run and had a lot of thoughts percolating in my head and thought they might be useful. I'm going to share them with a friend too. So I've got a good friend I was speaking to recently, and it made me realize that a lot of people are stuck in an old model about how carbohydrates affect health. And I've heard a lot of the same arguments back and forth for quite a while and wanted to just do a real thorough discussion of all these things. And I'll pass this along to clarify and help make some sense out of it for people. And it's pretty weird, I'm not the carb guy. It was funny, but back during the extreme low fat phase, I was talking about the benefits of fats, and it was completely heretical. But I was seeing evidence that olive oil was actually correlated with better health outcomes than those that avoided it. And there was a such thing as essential fatty acids. And proteins had a role too. So the funny thing is that back when I was railing against the extreme low-fat dogma. And now it's just hilarious that I find myself arguing against the opposite side of it. So back then I was defending fats and protein. Now I'm defending carbohydrate. And yeah, I have no real vested interest in this other than figuring out what's most effective for our mortality, our weight, and our disease risk. So there's a couple points to talk through here. And the basic idea is, if changing carbohydrate improves health outcome, if all factors are equal and if someone says, hey, I'm eating good food, but I'm concerned that I may have a weight problem because maybe I'm not as active as I maximally could be, so therefore I'll cut out my carbohydrate intake, my grain intake. And this is a hypothesis that has been centralized as the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And the model follows that if you consume carbohydrate, you make insulin. Insulin causes you to store fuel in various ways. That leads to these metabolic complications that all center around metabolic syndrome, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer risks, brain aging. So that's the basic model. And at a really superficial understanding of the mechanism, that could have been a plausible idea 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We didn't really understand energy balance quite as well in the popular health space. In the realm of biochemistry, we've never thought that was an accurate model, but nonetheless, those were theories that were circulating some time back, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, a decade ago at the most. Those were ideas that were out there. And, I want to, in answering this, talk about three big lines of evidence. This is how we always know what's true or what's not true, is we look at the mechanisms. So the first one is the mechanisms. Is this how we know the body works? If someone says that they have a perpetual motion device that will give you free energy, well, that violates a strong mechanism of the second law of thermodynamics. That's kind of a non-starter. Now, mechanisms are important to have, but they alone are probably the weakest assertion, because honestly, you can make a lot of mechanisms based on different levels of understanding, and some are more accurate than others, but many can make arguments sound quite plausible using mechanisms that are just not accurate or not perhaps the deepest level of understanding, or maybe don't reflect all facets of it. But you should have a supportive mechanism. Next thing is epidemiology. We should see that whatever we propose is how things play out in human populations. And epidemiology is fraught with problems. However, if you think about it, most of us rely a lot on our personal experience. We would always say, hey, this is what works for me. Well, the funny thing is that's actually epidemiology. that's that's looking at a human outcome. It's not well designed or controlled. It's not a large number of people, but it's epidemiology. So we all have an intuitive sense about, hey, let's see what actually happens to a person when they try that as far as being important. But somehow experts can think that it doesn't scale or that it only applies to one person at a time. But no, this is epidemiology. And then the last part is intervention. So what if you actually make a study in which you try to control one variable and see if that changes an outcome? And all these three lines of evidence, the mechanism, the epidemiology, the intervention, these are all models of reality. They're all models, they're all maps, they're all things that help us predict, and they're never perfect, but they're all of varying levels of value. And so we make a strong argument when those three lines converge, and we can see strong evidence in all three of those lines. So I'll talk through those. I'm also going to hit just some of the big tropes or the big phrases that people talk about in support of the carbohydrate model. So first off, let me do that. One is really the model itself, saying, hey, look, health issues relate to body weight. When they get more nuanced, they'll say, well, it's really over fat, which is true. It's more about weight in the wrong place, creating negative health outcomes, and that ultimately this over fat is a function of the body storing carbohydrate, and carbohydrate turning to fat, and fat causing these problems. And insulin drives this process. And since dietary carbohydrate can raise insulin, the main goal is not so much thinking just about food intake, total food intake, calories. It's really about carbohydrate intake. And there's always some concession, usually some concession about quality of carbohydrate. The earlier versions didn't have that, but they evolved some concession about food quality being relevant. But that's the basic model. So let's dig into that a little bit. Well, so one thought is just about the model itself. Is this the way the body regulates energy? Does the body say, hey, I've got a lot of insulin, therefore I need to store energy? Or are there other factors at play? And when we go deep in the biochemistry, what we see is that insulin is not the hub of energy metabolism. It's not a central regulator by any means. A strong counterexample is the case of type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetics have horrible regulation of glucose without being given insulin. So when their insulin levels go up, they have better health outcomes and they have less disease complications than when they have less insulin but more glucose. So insulin is somewhat responsive to carbohydrate more than other macronutrients, but it's one of many mechanisms of energy balance. There's probably not one central mechanism, but if you were to really pull into biochemistry right now, you would see a thing called AMP kinase probably being the most central molecule that regulates that. And AMP kinase, it's saying that you either take in fuel and store it, or you burn fuel. It's like kind of flipping that switch. And its main metric is really ATP status of the cell. Does the cell have enough energy, too much, too little? And based upon that, it determines how the body responds to that energy. And this energy is from fat, from carbohydrate. It can be from ketones. It can be from alcohol even. Protein does play out a little less differently than others, but ultimately it's energy balance. And you can change the carbohydrate status and not change energy balance, and things won't shift. So no, insulin is not the center of all of that. And we see this also even in type 2 diabetes, to where when they have bad glucose regulation, that they can be given insulin from outside their bodies and see better health outcomes. They can see weight loss. And you can also see states in which insulin is low and there's weight gain. People can gain weight on ketogenic diets with low levels of insulin. So insulin is not the deal breaker for body weight or for blood sugar. Now, diabetes also, in a mechanistic model, is not a disease of glucose overload. It's a disease of fuel overload. So you can't make diabetics by consuming nothing but carbohydrate. And actually, there was the rice diet by Dr. Jack Kempner out of Duke for quite some time. He reversed tons of cases of morbid obesity and diabetes and late-stage renal failure with carbohydrate-only diets. Now, what happens is when you're only eating carbohydrate, like white rice, sugar, fruit juice, this is what the diet was, no joke. When you only eat those foods, you fill up easily. They still ate a substantial food load in terms of calories, but they would reverse these chronic diseases. So ultimately, it's not about the idea of controlling insulin, lowering carbohydrate, as far as those effects go in a mechanistic model. It's more about general energy balance. Now, another argument I hear quite a bit is that there's no essential carbohydrate. And if we've got to compromise something on the diet, we should compromise carbohydrate because none of those are essential. Whereas fat, on the other hand, there are essential fats. So we should, if we're going to cut something out, we should cut out carbohydrate versus cutting out fat. Well, so let's think that through. Now, the assumption there is that a diet is healthy if it contains nothing extraneous, if we have nothing extra. So would you say that about vitamin C? Would you say that, if you need 10 milligrams a day to not get scurvy, then you should not consume 11 milligrams per day, that would be a bad thing? Probably not. And let's think that through further. So if that were the ultimate goal, what would the healthiest diet look like? I thought this through and, just throw myself out. Say I'm a 75 kilogram primate. And so in terms of essential nutrients, there's some vitamins and minerals, but with macronutrients, it's true that I don't have a very high requirement for macronutrients as an essential sense, meaning that I will get sick or have health problems in their absence. So what that would look like for macronutrients would be really just a few hundred milligrams of linoleic and linolenic acid per day. These are fatty acids. And then also probably about 0.4 of a gram of essential amino acids per kilogram of body weight per day, which ends up being about 30 grams. And so I could do 30 grams of essential amino acids, which is about an ounce. I've actually got a bag of essential amino acid powder upstairs. An ounce of that would not be a large amount. And I could do about a half a teaspoon of flax oil and cover that linoleic acid. Then throw a basic multivitamin, something like a Centrum, on top of that. Well, now I've met my essential macro and micronutrients. Does that mean that I will be healthiest if I do not consume any more food throughout the day than that? That's going to have, let's run the math real quick. So that half teaspoon of flax, that's going to be about 30, maybe call it 40 calories. And those essential amino acids, that's going to be maybe 120, maybe 150 calories. So I'm under 200 calories and there's none in that Centrum. And I've now just met my essential nutrients for the day. So should I stop eating? Is that going to make me completely healthy? Of course not. I would starve to death. I would be so devoid of just caloric load. So you can't say I'm only going to consume things that contain essential nutrients. And anyone would concede the fact that fats, for example, it's okay to eat fats beyond that half teaspoon of flax oil per day. There's a lot of great health benefits to nuts and seeds, to whole foods like avocados, to fatty fish. Fats, you cannot reduce them down to only their essential micronutrients. That's a misrepresentation. There's optimal intakes and there's benefits that are beyond that. And that's also true of carbohydrate. You can't say that the intake of carbohydrate is only tied to the intake of essential nutrients, because if you do that, you can't eat food. You can't, that model is just a total dead end. So once you concede that there are optimal intakes of nutrients that are beyond just meeting those bare minimal requirements, then now that argument about carbs being bad because you can get by without them, you have to throw that out. You have to acknowledge that no, we're not only consuming the bare minimum essential. That's not a good metric. That's not really the target. Now, another big argument that I've heard recently is that, well, we tried to go low carb in the 80s and it didn't work. Everyone kept on, the obesity crisis kept on moving unchecked. And if anything, it might have even escalated. So let's look at that one. Well, there were messages saying and actually when I looked at this historically, the messages were actually pretty tepid. They were rather balanced messages talking about avoiding empty calorie processed food and eating a variety of whole foods. It was pretty tepid stuff. No one said carbs are evil at the government level. And when we look at the population status, there was a decrease in percent of fat intake, and there was an increase in obesity. But let's dig a little bit deeper. Did people eat less fat? No, what happened was the absolute amount of fat never changed. But then how could the percent of fat change? Well, only one way with the numbers, and that's because the total food intake went up. And if you go really deep and analyze through it, what happened was the amount of fat went from about, as a nationwide individual level, went from about 37% to about 34%. So maybe a 3% change, not a lot, but it did go down. And yet obesity kept going up. But the absolute grams of fat didn't budge. No one consumed less fat. The percent only went down because people were eating more total food and more food in the form of processed carbohydrate. So there were those that took the message, and I would argue not the message from the government recommendations, but more so the message from some who were taking the extreme low fat view that anything that wasn't fat was fine. And they were then adding processed carbohydrate on top of their diet. And I think we're kind of at that same stage right now on the opposite end, where some are saying anything that's not carbohydrate is fine, and we're adding a lot of just unnecessary fat on top of the diet. But yeah, people didn't go low fat in the 80s. It never happened. We never decreased our total fat intake. Stephen Guyenet has some really good detailed write-ups and graphs that show all this stuff and in detailed numbers and some historical messages. So yeah, that actually didn't happen. We never went low fat in the 80s, and it never didn't work. We'll be right back after a word from Integrative Health.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. This is Dr. Linda Koshaba at Integrative Healthcare. So often we hear from our patients that their primary care physician has told them that their thyroid and hormone levels are fine, and they shouldn't worry. But the patients still have symptoms of severe fatigue, thinning hair, and weight issues. Unfortunately, this is too common with thyroid care. The good news is that we can help. There is hope. The doctors at Integrative Health, including myself, specialize in naturally treating thyroid, hormone, and adrenal issues. We would love to get you started on the path of ideal health. From the comfort of your own home, you can actually get treatment with one of our doctors at Integrative Health via a telemedicine appointment. Go to integrativehealthcare.com and become a new patient today. If you use the code PODCAST20, you get 20% off your new patient visit. Again, that website is integrativehealthcare.com and use code PODCAST20. Get back on the road to thriving.
And now, back for more medical myths, legends, and fairy tales. So now let's talk about those three lines of evidence, the mechanistic, the epidemiologic, and the interventional. I've touched on a little bit of the mechanistic already, but yeah, the big thing there is that whole carbohydrate insulin model. So the most superficial understanding, sure, you could say carbs are bad if insulin were the main hub that regulated energy, but insulin is not the main hub that regulates energy. If anything, the body regulates that based upon total energy, not just based upon one variable. And that's really reflective of how we work as omnivores. You know, there's not a diet that we could be on that had enough food for us to survive that we couldn't get by on for a while. You know, we can get by on a big mixture of foods and macronutrients and still do okay. So our bodies aren't going to be tricked and think, oh, wait, I'm eating carbohydrate, therefore I must balloon up beyond the point of health. Or if my carbohydrate goes down, then I'll starve myself to death. No, the body's much smarter than that, and it understands total fuel balance. And those decisions are made based upon total fuel load. And I would argue that the calorie model is probably closer, but it still misses some things, because what we see is that the way in which protein is metabolized is different. It does have a thermic effect. It does raise basal metabolic rate. It does have a stronger effect upon both satiety and satiation. They're actually different. So one is talking about how often you feel hungry, and the other is talking about how much food it takes to fill you up when you are eating. And yeah, protein impacts both of those. So it's a little different than just carbs and fats. But yeah, mechanistically, when we get deeper in the mechanisms, we don't find the carbohydrate insulin model is an accurate reflection of our best understanding of energy balance. So what about epidemiologic data? Well, what happens to populations of people at differing levels of carbohydrate intake? And what does our largest bodies of data tell us? You know, we take a look at the Mediterranean diets, the rural Asian diets, and the Nordic diets. And these are all ones that have data points, literally millions of human years to draw from. So millions of data points, like let's say you've got 100,000 people for 10 years, you know, that would be then 1 million data points. And these studies together, we have literally well over 1 million data points from which we can look. And all these diets are what would today be defined as high carbohydrate diets. These are between 45 to 65% calories from carbohydrate. And those predominantly are coming from grains, starchy vegetables, and fruits. You can't get that many carb calories from spinach. You just can't without exploding your stomach. So these cultures consume the bulk of their food from carbohydrate dense sources. And we saw that these cultures have had the lowest rates of obesity, chronic disease, various cancers, all these health conditions. And, it's tempting to say, well, they did this differently or they did that differently, and therefore that's why it happened. Maybe they were more physically active. Maybe they had less environmental pollutants, whatever it is. But the problem is that to say that that was the variable that really mattered, we could speculate that, but we couldn't know that without repeating a similar size study. So if we could rerun, a couple of several decades of a Mediterranean diet and change a variable, then we could say, oh yeah, we now know it was really because of this. And so I'm not saying that they were healthier because of their grains or their carbohydrates, but if the grains and carbohydrates were deleterious, as people say they are now, those people should not have been healthier. That doesn't stand. If there were some negative effects, it should have shown up in those populations. And somehow in the context of less processed food, all those other factors, it all worked out. So if these things were inherently bad, it should have showed up differently. Now, we've also seen some more recent epidemiologic studies looking at things like people that have electively gone low carbohydrate. And there was one Swedish study recently that showed that populations that had lowered their carbohydrate intake had increases in mortality. And once the study showed up, there was a lot of deconstruction that was done on the side of the low carbers as to why that was invalid. And the funny thing I would say is that, you know, again, studies are partial. Their maps or models are never perfect, and you can find fault with any study. But when you see people that have a certain stance or a certain viewpoint, which studies do they support and which studies do they find fault with? Do you go after studies with that same level of criticality when they agree with your stance than when they disagree with your stance? That's a question I would ask. I think that otherwise we can really fall prey to confirmation bias and find reasons to support the data with less judgment when it supports us, and find reasons to be critical of data when it doesn't support our favorite views. So that's an easy game to play. Case in point, there was a study that was done on some Asian populations, and the headline was lower carbohydrate diets correlated with less mortality. And I saw the paper come out, and moments after that, I saw a lot of my extreme low carb friends who were talking about this is the proof that we've all been waiting for. This kind of validated their whole platform. Well, so let's talk about definitions. What is low carbohydrate? What is high carbohydrate? Most now today talk about low carb diets being 20 to 35% carbohydrate. And most would say that a high carbohydrate diet is somewhere above that or in the 50 or 60% range. So this study, what did they define as the healthy low carbohydrate diet? Well, that was actually between 45 to 60% of calories was what they called low carbohydrate. So yeah, low relative to what? And what they called a high carbohydrate diet was more than 70% of calories. And when you got deep in this study, it was pretty unfortunate, but a high carbohydrate diet was basically a white rice only diet. This was diets that were markers correlated with low socioeconomic status. These are people that had just no food categories, no food options. They were at levels of just no health access, no health care, no real screening, no medical intervention. And they had more mortality from things like infectious disease. So they were malnourished and they were under cared for medically. And that's what the high carbohydrate meant. But again, even if you just ignored that part and ignored the labels high and low and looked at percentages, what were healthiest in these populations were what most of us would call a reasonable amount of carbohydrate. They weren't on what the modern Americans would call a low carbohydrate diet. So yeah, I like to take epidemiology more so at face value whenever possible. And if I find myself calling it into question, I really have to ask, I say, hey, look, is this confirmation bias? Do I not like this study because it doesn't like my cherished beliefs? In those cases, I need to be a little bit more loosely attached to my cherished beliefs. But that's something I think about whenever I hear people criticize epidemiology, is that they always criticize, or I'll often see it to where if they've got a certain stance, like they're hardcore low carb or hardcore this or that, that they really criticize the epidemiology that doesn't support them. I was really active in a group for quite a while that was doing hormonal replacement, and there's a valid role for that, and it can be done well and safely and to good effect. But there's an extreme view that almost argues that everyone could benefit from massive amounts of that, and there's no possible downside. And I would see year after year, this group would take whatever emerged studies that were negative about any model of hormone replacement, and they would pick those studies apart and then at face value lionize and cast favorable views upon the studies that supported hormone replacement. I'm like, no, that's not fair. You can't pick apart those and like these just as they are. So that's the thing, is you've got to really hold equal standards, and you can't just decide which studies to nitpick on and which ones to go along with. So that's the general thing. So other things about epidemiology we're seeing is that if the model about carbs being problems for weight and health outcomes were valid, we should see epidemiology also reflecting that. And we've not. So the populations that have been studied that have been avoiding grains, gluten-free, lower carbohydrate, we've not seen better health outcomes. We've actually seen they've had more rates of cardiovascular death, more rates of diabetes, and more rates of obesity. So it's not supporting it at that level either. So then we think about interventional studies. So what happens if you actually assign people to a diet, and what goes on? And I think this is where I find the evidence especially compelling. A decade or so ago, you could have said with intellectual honesty, perhaps the message of avoid carbohydrates would correlate with less food intake and lower body weight and better health outcomes. And that would have been a plausible thing to say a decade ago. But since then, we've had so many large interventional studies done, and many have run out for 2 years. And it's been the same outcome every time. If you tell one group of people, lower your carbohydrate intake, you tell another group of people, lower your fat intake, and you tell another group of people, lower your food intake, there's no advantage of one of those over another when you play it out long enough. Now, what happened is that some studies did not control for protein intake. And it turns out that some people, if they're told to lower their carbohydrate intake, they inadvertently raise their protein intake. They swap their potatoes for more meat, quite simply. And in those cases, they're eating more protein, and that by itself does have an effect. That does cause more satiety, more body composition, more metabolism. And those things do play out. But once you control for protein and say, okay, so what's a low carb, high protein diet look like compared to a low fat, high protein diet? Then once you do that, the carb difference vanishes, and it seems that the protein was a relevant variable. But once you control for protein, all the interventional studies have shown that there's no difference on substituting carbs for fats as far as body weight. One is not better than another. What we have seen too is that there have been some diets that have been shorter term but have been done in metabolic wards in which they've controlled the food intake. So we know each group is getting the same calorie load and the same protein amount, the same carbs and fats. I'm sorry, but then differing only the carbs and fats. And in those studies, we've seen the same thing. And actually, the most extreme version of that was done by a group that they candidly said they were trying to finally prove their model that carbohydrates were the cause of this. So they designed a study in which it was done in a metabolic ward. They put together a well-done study, and the study was checking to see if people on the same calorie load, one group being ketogenic, extremely low carb, the other group on what could have been called a straw man diet that was really high in processed carbohydrate and high in sugar, but identical for calories. And their stated goal was to show that there was a superior outcome in terms of metabolism and weight loss and fat loss in this extreme low carb versus this high processed carb, even when calories were controlled. That was their agenda. And had they had that outcome, I'd be having a different conversation with you guys today. I'd say that we've got evidence that supports that model, but they didn't have that outcome. Their study showed that when calories were controlled, there was more fat loss in a high sugar diet than there was in a ketogenic diet. And it was sad. The researchers, some of the people who led the study, had they done the right thing, they would have said, we might need to recheck our hypothesis. We should move on or revisit our hypothesis. But rather, they created a conflict with one of the head researchers who gathered numbers. And this man has made many public statements saying, look, I did an accurate job and these were what the findings were, and they didn't like it, but I'm sorry, this is how biology played out. And this man, Kevin Hall, he's gone on to do some really good studies in which he's controlled for processed food. So one group of people is on high amounts of processed food, the other is on less processed food. They're allowed to eat freely. And he showed that that difference alone correlated with a difference of many hundreds of calories of spontaneous food intake. And that's powerful data. We want to figure out what the factor that is. If it was carbohydrate, that's fine. We could have seen that. We had plenty of opportunity for that to show up, and we could then act on that. But it didn't show up. Maybe processed food is the main variable. That makes a lot more sense. And there's now emerging data supporting that. So let's move forward with that direction. But yeah, the idea that carbohydrate uniquely causes weight gain, uniquely causes negative health outcomes, that was a hypothesis a while back, but it just didn't pan out. So the idea of really demonizing a food group, it often ends up being counterproductive. People become more orthorexic, they become more fearful of food. And then we look at one of the most robust findings in all of medicine is the benefit of fiber. The amount of fiber we consume, and probably even more so the diversity of fiber we consume in the diet. We hear that the gut flora helps everything. Well, the gut flora lives off of fiber. These indigestible components, including resistant starch, that's what drives our immune system, our blood sugar regulation, our body's regulation of inflammatory levels. It's super critical. And you cannot consume a robust total amount, and you cannot consume a robust diversity of fiber on a diet that limits and restricts carbohydrates in amount and in type. You just can't do both. So I'm passionate about this. Again, I have no agenda about carbs. If the data played out differently, I'd be telling you guys, hey, look, it seems that cutting out carbohydrates is an effective message for weight loss and health outcomes. But that's just not what the data from the last decade has shown us. So it's really time for us to dust off our feet, dust off our knees, I guess, and stand up and move away from that agenda. And let's think more about, it looks like the level of food processing, the amount of food diversity, the satiety loads are very relevant. And it wasn't that carbohydrates were the villain. I won't get into the discussion about grains and gluten, but the same things can be said here, that there were plausible arguments a while back about these things being problems, but they've already been studied, and the ship is sailed. Those ideas have just come and gone. So let's focus in on what does matter the most and make sure that our messages are in alignment with what's going to be effective. So, yeah. Well, sun's just coming up. I'm going to go. The sun is just coming up literally on the horizon, and my son is waking up soon for his day at school. So I'm going to go get his breakfast together, which will include some healthy fats, some healthy carbs, some proteins, lots of fruits and vegetables, and I'll get some lunch going for him. And when I feed myself too, I'm hungry. So take care, you guys, and we'll talk more really soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.